Nike didn't hesitate on Caitlin Clark. They didn't miss the moment. They didn't second-guess her talent. They waited. And that wait is the part everyone got wrong. Because if this was just about selling shoes, Nike would have moved immediately. The buzz was there. The numbers were there. The cameras were already following her everywhere she went. In modern sports marketing, that's usually the green light. Strike while the noise is loud. Cash in while attention is hot. Nike did the opposite. No signature shoe. No massive rollout. No takeover campaign. Just silence. And silence from Nike is never accidental. Nike doesn't rush moments. They build eras. And they don't build eras around potential. They wait until influence becomes unavoidable. Until the entire ecosystem bends without being pushed. That's what they were watching with Caitlin Clark. Early on, the conversation stayed surface level. Scoring records. Logo threes. Viral highlights. Insane shooting range. All impressive, but none of that alone explains why Nike delayed when every other brand would have sprinted forward. Because this wasn't about highlights. It was about dependency. Nike wanted to see whether Caitlin Clark was just driving excitement or quietly becoming the axis everything rotated around. There's a difference, and it's massive. Plenty of athletes generate buzz. Very few cause systems to react when they're removed. That's the test Nike was waiting for. And without meaning to, the league handed them the answer. When Caitlin Clark wasn't on the floor, something shifted. Coverage softened. Conversations slowed. Energy dipped. Not because the league lacked talent, but because attention had learned where to live. Then, the moment she came back, everything snapped into place again. Ratings jumped. Focus returned. The narrative tightened. That pattern matters more than any single stat line. Hype comes and goes. Reliance doesn't. And Nike saw it forming in real time. That's why the delay stretched on while fans started questioning the move. People called it strange. Some called it disrespectful. Others wondered if Nike was unsure about the WNBA itself. But Nike wasn't confused. They were counting. They were measuring how much gravity Caitlin Clark actually carried. Because once an athlete becomes the reason people show up, and the reason they notice when she's gone, that athlete isn't just marketable anymore. She's foundational. And when Nike finally moved, they didn't whisper. They chose the loudest day in American sports. But that wasn't the boldest part. Because the real message wasn't in when the ad aired. It was in how it was built. And most people missed that completely. But that wasn't the whole story. Because the next move revealed exactly who Nike believes Caitlin Clark already is. Nike didn't choose Christmas Day by accident. That window is sacred. NFL games dominate. NBA matchups pull in casual fans and diehards at the same time. Every second of airtime is expensive, and every placement is intentional. That space isn't used to introduce experiments or test interest. It's reserved for athletes who already carry weight. So when the From Anywhere commercial aired in that slot, Nike wasn't asking for attention. They were declaring status. This wasn't a breakout moment. It was a confirmation moment. A quiet way of saying the conversation had already ended. Caitlin Clark wasn't being introduced to the public. The public had already decided. Nike was just acknowledging what the numbers, the crowds, and the coverage had been showing for months. And the structure of the ad made that even clearer. This wasn't a modern, fast-cut hype reel designed for social media scrolling. It moved with patience, confidence, familiarity. The entire format echoed one of Nike's most legendary blueprints. Two athletes. Impossible shots. Casual trash talk. No explanation needed. It was a callback to Jordan and Bird. Nike didn't say that out loud. They never do. But they don't mirror that structure unless they want the audience to feel something deeper than a commercial. That template is reserved for athletes who represent eras, not moments. And Caitlin Clark stepped into that space without being labeled, announced, or crowned. That's important. Nike didn't need to tell you she mattered. They let the placement do the talking. Every detail reinforced it. The pacing, the tone, the absence of desperation. No loud slogans. No forced emotion. Just the assumption that you already knew who she was and why she belonged there. Even the people in the ad weren't random. Different worlds. Different audiences. Same question. Can you make it from here? That repetition wasn't about distance. It was about belief. Every voice represented a different corner of culture intersecting at the same point. Basketball fans, casual viewers, music audiences, sports media, all watching the same figure bend the conversation in her direction. That kind of convergence doesn't happen by chance. And Nike doesn't step into it unless they're sure it holds. But here's where it gets more interesting. Because most viewers watched the commercial once and moved on. They saw the shots. They heard the slogan. They felt the vibe. Then they kept scrolling. But Nike layered the ad with details meant for people who were actually paying attention. And one of those details said more than any headline ever could. Because Nike wasn't just celebrating where Caitlin Clark is now. They were reminding everyone where she came from. And what they hid in plain sight changed the meaning of the entire campaign. But that detail went unnoticed by most people. And once you see it, the plan becomes impossible to ignore. Here's where Nike separated casual viewers from people who really understand how this brand operates. Because the From Anywhere campaign wasn't built for everyone to fully decode on first watch. Nike doesn't do surface-level storytelling when they're dealing with legacy athletes. They embed meaning quietly, knowing the right people will catch it later. And the most important signal in the entire commercial wasn't a shot. It was a moment. At exactly the 22-second mark, Lisa Blutter appears. That alone might seem harmless. But nothing Nike does is random, especially not timing. 22 isn't just a number. It's Caitlin Clark's number. And Blutter isn't just any coach. She's the one who stood on the sideline while Caitlin rewrote college basketball history. Even more telling, Blutter is standing on the exact floor location where Caitlin Clark broke the NCAA all-time scoring record. That wasn't nostalgia. That was Nike saying, we remember the origin story. And brands don't reference origins unless they're building continuity. You don't remind people where something started unless you expect it to last long enough for that history to matter. This moment wasn't meant to go viral. It wasn't designed to be clipped. It was designed to sit quietly beneath the surface, reinforcing trust with fans who followed Caitlin Clark since the beginning. The people who watched her before sold-out arenas. Before national broadcasts adjusted schedules around her. Before the league had to reckon with how much attention she actually carried. Nike was speaking directly to them. And that tells you something critical. This campaign wasn't about convincing skeptics. Nike already knows skepticism doesn't matter once momentum locks in. They were rewarding belief. Acknowledging the fans who stayed through every phase of the climb. That's how long-term brand loyalty is cemented. On the surface, the message feels simple. Caitlin Clark can shoot from anywhere. Logo range. Half court. Defenders fading into the background. Distance doesn't matter. But that's not the real message. The deeper meaning is that she came from anywhere. A small town. A non-traditional pipeline. A market nobody expected to produce the most influential figure in women's basketball. She didn't come from an established powerhouse ecosystem. She didn't inherit momentum. She created it. That's why the slogan works on multiple levels. It speaks basketball language and belief language at the same time. Kids hear it and think about shots. Brands hear it and think about scalability. Culture hears it and thinks about access. And Nike needs all three. Because they're not just selling a shoe. They're expanding a platform. That's also why the celebrity appearances mattered more than people realized. The Kelsey brothers. Travis Scott. Different lanes, different demographics, different audiences. Each one intersects with a real chapter of Caitlin Clark's rise. Media attention. Pop culture relevance. Mainstream recognition. They weren't there for star power. They were there to prove reach. Every voice asking the same question wasn't coincidence. It was a math equation. Caitlin Clark isn't confined to one audience or one identity. She travels between spaces without losing meaning. That's rare. And brands notice that faster than fans do. But here's where the narrative takes a turn. Because even after all of this, Nike still didn't release the shoe. No drop. No pre-order. No launch date. And that's the part that confused people the most. Why reveal all this power and then hold back? Because Nike had one final test they needed answered. And the league itself accidentally provided it. What happened next turned silence into certainty. And showed exactly why Nike believes Caitlin Clark is bigger than one season. Here's the moment that quietly settled the debate inside Nike's headquarters. It wasn't a highlight. It wasn't a buzzer beater. It wasn't even a win. It was what happened when Caitlin Clark wasn't on the floor. When she went down with injury, the reaction wasn't emotional at first. It was analytical. Viewership dipped. Engagement slowed. Social conversation flattened. Games that would have been national talking points suddenly blended into the background. And when she returned, everything snapped back instantly. Ratings surged. Clips flooded timelines. Arenas buzzed again. The difference wasn't subtle, it was measurable. That pattern told Nike something far more valuable than hype ever could. This wasn't interest. This was dependence. The league didn't just benefit from Caitlin Clark's presence. It reacted to her absence. That distinction changes everything. Hype-driven stars spike once and fade. Reliance-driven stars reshape systems. When a league's momentum visibly slows without one player, that player stops being a feature and starts becoming infrastructure. Nike noticed. So did broadcasters. So did advertisers. And that's when silence stopped looking like hesitation and started looking like leverage. Because the WNBA wasn't just dealing with growing pains at the same time. It was staring down real uncertainty. CBA negotiations. Fan fatigue. Questions about how long momentum could last once novelty wore off. The league needed stability. It needed continuity. It needed someone who could anchor attention through turbulence. And right now, there's only one name that consistently does that. Caitlin Clark. Nike doesn't chase moments. They protect futures. And futures are built around reliability, not flash. When Nike saw numbers dip and rise in direct correlation to one player, that wasn't a red flag, it was confirmation. They weren't early anymore. They were right on time. That's why releasing a shoe in 2024 would have been a mistake. It would have framed Caitlin Clark as a moment. A surge. A wave. And waves crash. Platforms don't. Waiting turns scarcity into gravity. Scarcity doesn't just increase demand, it increases meaning. By holding back, Nike allowed anticipation to mature. They let the audience fill the silence with belief. They let the league itself prove the case for her value. That's power you can't manufacture with ads. And here's where most people misunderstood the strategy. This partnership was never meant to be treated like a collector's drop or a quick sellout flex. Nike isn't positioning Caitlin Clark as a limited-time release. They're positioning her as an entry point. Youth basketball, grassroots programs, international expansion. Girls who've never seen someone shoot like that and look like them at the same time. You don't scale that overnight. You build the system first. If Nike had rushed, the shoe would have been locked to one season's narrative. The story would have peaked too early. International growth would have stalled. The platform would have felt incomplete. Instead, they waited until influence was undeniable. No more hypotheticals. No more debates. Just data. That's the moment when a product stops being a release and starts becoming a foundation. And the From Anywhere campaign wasn't selling footwear. It was shaping perception. Nike didn't introduce a shoe. They introduced an idea. The idea that Caitlin Clark doesn't depend on setting, timing, or context. She transcends them. Wherever the game goes, attention follows. Whatever the environment, gravity bends. By the time the shoe arrives, the narrative won't need explanation. It will already be absorbed. But there's still one layer most people haven't considered yet. Because Nike isn't just thinking about Caitlin Clark today. They're thinking about what happens after her influence forces the league to evolve. And that's where this strategy becomes much bigger than basketball. This is where Nike's strategy stops looking like marketing and starts looking like power. Because patience isn't passive. Patience is leverage, when you can afford it. Nike could wait because Caitlin Clark kept proving something every single season. Her relevance didn't expire. It compounded. Each year didn't reset the narrative. It layered on top of it. New fans didn't replace old ones. They stacked. That's rare. Most athletes peak during their loudest moment. The spotlight hits, sales spike, then attention drifts. Nike has lived through that cycle enough times to recognize when something different is happening. With Caitlin Clark, attention didn't just spike. It stabilized. And stability is what allows control. When Nike delays a release, they're not gambling. They're synchronizing timelines. Athlete prime, league growth, media rights, global reach, cultural acceptance. Everything has to align, or the product burns too fast. That's why this rollout is being treated less like a sneaker drop and more like a franchise launch. Think about it. Nike doesn't build Jordan retros by accident. They don't rush LeBron models just to ride a news cycle. Those lines last because they were positioned as eras, not moments. And for the first time, Nike is applying that same framework to women's basketball without qualifiers or hedging. No test run. No see how it sells. No limited experiment. Time was the investment. Every season Nike waited, Caitlin Clark gained something more valuable than hype: authority. She stopped being introduced. She became assumed. Broadcasters framed games around her presence. Opponents adjusted schedules. Arenas sold tickets before rosters were even announced. That's when influence flips. You're no longer chasing attention. Attention reorganizes itself around you. And Nike doesn't move until that happens. Behind the scenes, this changes the balance of power entirely. Caitlin Clark doesn't need Nike to validate her anymore. Nike needs her alignment to anchor their next chapter in basketball. That mutual dependency reshapes negotiations, design control, rollout timing, and long-term direction. That's why this partnership feels quiet instead of loud. Loud campaigns beg. Quiet campaigns assume. Nike isn't asking fans to believe in Caitlin Clark. They're responding to belief that already exists. By the time the shoe arrives, it won't feel like discovery. It will feel like correction, like something overdue finally catching up to reality. And that feeling is powerful because it doesn't rely on persuasion. It relies on recognition. But there's another reason Nike waited that most people still aren't talking about. Because releasing a women's signature shoe too early doesn't just risk underperforming. It risks defining the ceiling. Once a product is framed as niche, it's nearly impossible to expand it later. Early framing determines long-term perception. Nike wasn't willing to let Caitlin Clark's line be labeled before the audience fully understood her scale. So they waited until her audience stopped being WNBA fans and started becoming sports fans. Until NFL players referenced her. Until NBA stars showed up unprompted. Until cultural conversations included her name without explanation. That's when the ceiling disappeared. And now, Nike isn't introducing a shoe. They're introducing a standard. One that doesn't reset each season. One that doesn't rely on constant reinvention. One that grows alongside the athlete instead of burning through her. This is the moment where the rollout shifts from patience to permanence. And once permanence enters the picture, the league itself has no choice but to adapt. Because when one athlete becomes the reference point, everything else starts aligning: storytelling, investment, youth development, international attention. That doesn't just elevate one career. It restructures the ecosystem. And that restructuring? That's already happening. This is where Caitlin Clark stops being just a star inside the WNBA and becomes a force acting on the league itself. Because leagues don't like to admit this, but they rarely control their own evolution. They respond to pressure. And Caitlin Clark created pressure the WNBA wasn't prepared for. Look at what changed the moment she entered the league. Not gradually. Immediately. Scheduling decisions. Broadcast windows. Ticket pricing. Media framing. Entire road trips started selling out weeks in advance. Not because of rivalries, not because of playoff stakes, but because she was coming to town. That's structural impact. When one player can change revenue expectations in cities she doesn't even play for, the system starts bending around her presence. And once that bending begins, it doesn't snap back. This is why Nike's timing mattered so much. Releasing a signature shoe too early would have framed Caitlin Clark as a beneficiary of the WNBA's growth. Waiting allowed the narrative to flip. Now the league's growth is visibly tied to her gravity. That distinction changes everything. Because now, when negotiations happen, media deals, sponsorship packages, international expansion, the question isn't, how do we grow women's basketball? It becomes, how do we protect and scale what she's already pulling into the system? That's a very different conversation. You could see it during her injury stretch. Viewership dipped. Social engagement slowed. Conversations cooled. And when she returned, everything snapped back into place like a light switch flipped on. That wasn't hype. That was dependency. And leagues don't like dependency, especially on a single player. But they also can't deny it when the data is that clear. Caitlin Clark didn't just notice the league. She revealed its pressure points. This is why the WNBA suddenly feels like it's at a crossroads. On one side, there's tradition, slow growth, controlled narratives, cautious branding. On the other side, there's acceleration, new fans, louder audiences, crossover attention, and expectations that no longer fit inside the old framework. Caitlin Clark didn't create that tension. She exposed it. Nike saw it coming. They understood that once the league hit this phase, any product tied to Caitlin Clark wouldn't just represent her. It would symbolize where women's basketball was headed. That's why this shoe isn't being positioned as a one-season highlight. It's being built to survive league shifts, labor disputes, media realignments, and audience changes. Because no matter what happens structurally, her presence remains the anchor. And that's the part that quietly shifts power away from institutions and toward individuals. When a league depends on you to stabilize attention, you gain leverage without ever asking for it. You don't have to speak loudly. You don't have to posture. Your absence does the talking for you. That's why Caitlin Clark doesn't rush appearances. That's why her messaging stays measured. That's why Nike's rollout avoids panic. They're operating from inevitability. This also explains why younger players are watching this moment differently. For the first time, the blueprint doesn't end at make the league. It extends beyond it. Visibility doesn't flatten once you arrive. It expands. That realization changes behavior. It changes ambition. It changes how players think about timing, branding, and control. The WNBA didn't plan for this moment. But now that it's here, it has no choice but to adapt around it. Because when one player becomes the axis, the system reorients whether it wants to or not. And this leads to the biggest question Nike had to answer before pulling the trigger. What happens after the launch? This is where the story separates casual observers from people who actually understand power. Because while fans were yelling, analysts were speculating, and social media kept asking the same question over and over. Why hasn't Nike dropped the shoe yet? Nike wasn't confused. Nike wasn't hesitant. Nike wasn't behind. Nike was measuring. And that distinction matters more than anything. Nike doesn't build campaigns around popularity spikes. They build around durability. The brand has seen hype rise and collapse too many times to confuse attention with staying power. Viral moments are cheap. Legacy is expensive. And Nike only invests at scale when they believe an athlete can hold pressure long after the spotlight peaks. That's why the silence felt uncomfortable to people watching from the outside. Because in modern sports culture, silence gets mistaken for doubt. But inside Nike, silence usually means something very different. It means they're watching behavior, not headlines. Patterns, not praise. What happens when the moment isn't perfect? What happens when things slow down? What happens when the machine isn't pushing anymore? And Caitlin Clark passed every one of those tests. When she was injured, viewership dipped, not collapsed, but dipped noticeably. When she returned, it snapped right back. That's a signal brands pay close attention to. It means interest isn't tied to novelty. It means audiences didn't move on. They waited. That's not hype. That's reliance. Nike also watched how the league moved around her. Broadcast decisions. Scheduling priorities. Media framing. Games weren't just featuring Caitlin Clark anymore. They were being built around her presence. That's when an athlete stops being talent and starts becoming leverage. And leverage is what Nike values most. Here's what most people miss. Nike doesn't rush signature shoes because shoes lock narratives in place. Once a shoe drops, the athlete's story becomes fixed. The design, the messaging, the positioning, it all becomes a snapshot in time. If you release too early, you trap the athlete inside a version of themselves they may outgrow. Nike waited because Caitlin Clark was still expanding. Her influence wasn't stabilizing yet, it was compounding. Every season removed doubt instead of adding questions. Every appearance widened her audience instead of narrowing it. Every off-court moment reinforced control instead of chaos. That's rare. Most stars peak loudly and then level off. Caitlin's curve stayed steep, but calm. No desperation. No forced branding. No chasing attention. Just accumulation. Nike noticed that. They also noticed something else most people ignored. Caitlin Clark didn't need Nike to validate her. That's the most dangerous position an athlete can be in for a brand. Because when an athlete doesn't need you, the partnership flips. The brand becomes the one aligning, not leading. Nike isn't afraid of that dynamic, but they are careful with it. They waited until Caitlin Clark's presence became unavoidable. Until the conversation shifted from should Nike do more to why hasn't this already happened? That's when the power balance becomes clean. Scarcity wasn't an accident. It was leverage. By holding back, Nike let the public do the convincing for them. Let fans build anticipation organically. Let debate turn into expectation. And expectation, when unmet long enough, turns into pressure. Pressure Nike controls better than anyone. This also explains why the rollout feels restrained instead of explosive. Nike isn't treating this like a limited drop or a collector's moment. They're treating it like infrastructure. Youth programs, grassroots access, international pathways. You don't rush those things. You build them underneath first. If Nike had dropped the shoe in 2024, it would have been celebrated, and then compared to the next thing. Waiting allowed it to become a reference point instead. That's the difference between a release and a standard. By the time the shoe finally arrives, it won't feel like Nike betting on Caitlin Clark. It will feel like Nike acknowledging what already exists. And that's the last step before something stops being questioned at all. Because once a brand like Nike stops explaining itself, it means they believe the audience already understands. And that's where this story starts to turn into something much bigger than a product. Because when patience replaces promotion, it usually means the endgame is already decided. And that brings us to the part that changes everything. This is where the conversation quietly shifts from brand strategy to something much more uncomfortable. Because once Nike aligned itself this patiently, this deliberately, it sent a message that went far beyond marketing. It said Caitlin Clark wasn't being treated as a league asset anymore. She was being treated as an independent force. And that distinction changes everything. For decades, women's basketball operated under a very specific structure. The league was the engine. Players were beneficiaries. Exposure flowed downward. Platforms were granted, not earned. Even the biggest stars still moved within the gravitational pull of the WNBA itself. Caitlin Clark disrupted that balance without ever saying a word about it. She didn't demand special treatment. She didn't position herself against the league. She didn't frame her rise as a rebellion. She simply became too big to be contained. You can see it in how conversations form around her. Games aren't promoted as Fever versus whoever anymore. They're promoted as Caitlin Clark is playing tonight. Broadcast crews lead with her availability before mentioning matchups. Ticket prices don't fluctuate based on standings. They fluctuate based on whether she's in uniform. That's not favoritism. That's gravity. And once gravity exists, systems adjust whether they want to or not. Nike understood this before most fans did. They saw that Caitlin Clark didn't rely on league storytelling to remain relevant. Her narrative carried across NBA spaces, sneaker culture, youth hoops, mainstream sports talk, and global basketball audiences who didn't even follow the WNBA closely. That kind of crossover isn't normal. More importantly, it's irreversible. Once an athlete becomes a shared reference point across different audiences, their influence no longer resets with seasons or standings. It compounds. Even absence becomes meaningful. That's why her injury mattered more than people realized. When she went out, ratings dipped, not catastrophically, but noticeably. That subtle dip told Nike everything they needed to know. Fans weren't just consuming the league. They were following her presence within it. The league didn't collapse without her. But it slowed. And slowing is dangerous when momentum is the entire business model. This is where things start getting tense behind the scenes. Because leagues are built to elevate stars, but not to be overshadowed by them. When one player becomes the primary driver of attention, every structural decision suddenly carries more weight. Scheduling, marketing priorities, CBA negotiations, media strategy, everything becomes more sensitive. Not because Caitlin Clark is doing anything wrong, but because the ecosystem hasn't fully adjusted to someone like her yet. Nike isn't just aware of this tension. They're positioned perfectly inside it. By delaying the shoe, Nike avoided tying Caitlin Clark's identity too tightly to any single league moment. They let her brand mature independently. They allowed her influence to stretch beyond seasonal narratives and contractual uncertainties. That's critical timing, especially with the WNBA facing real questions about its future structure. Media rights changes, labor negotiations, fan fatigue around off-court conflicts. None of that is Caitlin Clark's responsibility, but all of it affects perception. Nike insulated her from that noise. And here's the part most people aren't ready to talk about yet. Once an athlete reaches this level of independence, they stop needing institutions to validate them. Institutions start needing them to stabilize the system. That flips leverage. Not in a dramatic, public way, but in quiet negotiations, subtle scheduling decisions, and unspoken assumptions about what can and can't happen without risk. Caitlin Clark doesn't have to threaten anything to hold power. Her presence already does. Nike knows this. Broadcasters know this. Sponsors know this. And slowly, very carefully, the league is being forced to acknowledge it too. But acknowledgement always lags reality. And when it finally catches up, it creates friction. Because the question is no longer whether Caitlin Clark is the face of women's basketball. The real question becomes, what happens when the face grows faster than the frame built to hold it? That's where this story stops being comfortable. And that's exactly where the next part begins. Every major shift creates resistance before it creates acceptance. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because once Caitlin Clark became the gravitational center of women's basketball, the conversation didn't just change outside the league, it changed inside it. Quietly, carefully, behind closed doors, where decisions are made without microphones or comment sections. No one said her name publicly. They didn't have to. You could feel it in the way debates started forming. Is the coverage too focused on one player? Are we creating unrealistic expectations? Is this sustainable for the league long term? On the surface, those sound like reasonable questions. But underneath them was something else entirely. Control. Leagues are built on balance. Even star-driven leagues prefer the illusion of parity because parity protects structure. When one figure begins pulling disproportionate attention, everything else feels smaller by comparison. Teams, rivalries, even championships risk becoming secondary narratives. That makes executives nervous. Not because they dislike the player, but because they don't fully control the direction anymore. Caitlin Clark never asked to be positioned this way. She didn't campaign for extra spotlight. She didn't demand national broadcasts. She didn't shape storylines herself. The audience did. And audiences are unpredictable. That's the real fear. Because once fans decide who matters most, institutional messaging loses influence. Marketing departments can amplify interest, but they can't manufacture it at this scale. When the crowd moves on its own, the system has to follow, or risk being ignored. That's why some of the pushback feels passive instead of aggressive. You don't see public criticism. You see subtle reframing. You see conversations about the league as a whole. You see reminders that basketball is bigger than one player. All true, but also defensive. Because no one wants to say the quiet part out loud. The league benefits enormously from Caitlin Clark, but it's also exposed by her. She highlights gaps that were easier to ignore before. In infrastructure, in marketing consistency, in long-term planning. When one player spikes ratings this sharply, it forces uncomfortable comparisons. Why don't other games perform the same way? Why does attention concentrate so heavily? Why does momentum feel fragile without her presence? Those aren't questions about Caitlin Clark. They're questions about readiness. Nike didn't cause this tension, but they recognized it instantly. By positioning Caitlin Clark as more than a seasonal story, Nike stepped outside league dependency. They framed her as durable regardless of structural uncertainty. That protects her brand, but it also removes pressure from Nike to defend league decisions. If the system wobbles, Caitlin Clark doesn't. That's leverage again. And it's leverage that doesn't need to be used aggressively to be effective. You can see it in how carefully everyone speaks now, in how rarely her name is attached to controversy, in how controlled her appearances remain. Silence becomes strategy at this level. Because the moment Caitlin Clark engages directly with tension, the narrative shifts. So she doesn't. She lets gravity do the work. And gravity doesn't argue. It just pulls. That's why the pushback hasn't slowed her rise. It's only made the stakes clearer. Because when resistance exists without confrontation, it means everyone is waiting. Waiting to see how far this goes. Waiting to see whether the system adapts or cracks. And that brings us to the part most people aren't ready for yet. Because the next phase isn't about conflict. It's about inevitability. And once inevitability sets in, decisions stop being optional. At a certain point, resistance stops mattering. Not because it disappears, but because reality becomes heavier than denial. That's where this story ends. Caitlin Clark didn't break women's basketball. She didn't hijack it. She didn't outgrow it out of arrogance or ambition. She simply revealed where it already was. Every league eventually meets a player who exposes the gap between intention and infrastructure. Someone whose presence accelerates timelines faster than leadership anticipated. Someone who forces hard questions earlier than planned. That's Caitlin Clark. Nike didn't manufacture this moment. They recognized it. They waited while the environment adjusted itself. They watched as the audience made decisions before executives did. They understood that once belief exists at scale, marketing becomes confirmation, not persuasion. That's why this never felt loud. Loud campaigns beg for attention. Quiet ones assume it's already there. By the time the shoe finally arrives, it won't feel like a launch. It'll feel like something that should have existed all along, finally catching up to reality. And that's the real shift. Caitlin Clark didn't need a signature shoe to validate her. The league didn't need Nike to survive. But together, timing created something bigger than either side alone. Not a moment, a reference point. Years from now, people won't point to a single game or commercial and say, "That's when everything changed." They'll point to this stretch of time, this quiet build, this alignment between talent, audience, and patience. This was the moment women's basketball stopped chasing validation and started commanding attention. And the most important part? It didn't happen because someone forced it. It happened because enough people believed, long before the system caught up. That's how eras begin. If you want to stay ahead of where this sport is actually going, not just where the headlines land, make sure you subscribe. These are the stories beneath the surface, the moves before they're obvious, and the shifts before they're announced. Hit like if this breakdown made you see the bigger picture. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And stay locked in, because this story didn't end here. It just reached the point where there's no going back.